The 80s had the General. The 90s had John Gilligan. In the noughties, it was the reign of Martin Marlowe Hyland. His was a familiar path with success and power, and then the recklessness. He had to go, because with him, an innocent young man doing an honest day's work died. Crime World presents Caught in the Crossfire, the unsolved murders of coke kingpin Marlowe Hyland and innocent Anthony Campbell. Available now on all podcast platforms. So, last week, something pretty disgusting happened. So, I'm going to ask you to explain it. And I hope that the vehicle in question is in getting disinfected still.
Yeah, well, I can't comment on that.
Right, go on. Tell us what happened.
Basically, we were out for the day. The funeral of Fran The Lamb Cunningham was on, but it wasn't their priority. We were out on a different job, which finished earlier than expected. So we had time. While we had time, we shot over to the funeral. Now, as you know, Fran The Lamb wouldn't have been a high priority target for us over many years. His two brothers, Mick and John Cunningham, aka the Colonel, they would have been. I had photographed Mick Cunningham a couple of times, and of course, John Cunningham, being so high up in the Kinahan organised crime gang, would be a top target. And the last time we photographed him would have been at Mick's funeral. So the chance of him showing up with all the stuff that's going on at the moment, you know, with the US authorities and everything, it was highly unlikely that John Cunningham would show up. But we were basically there just in case somebody of interest might show up. The funeral itself wouldn't have been a top priority for us, but the people who might be attending, that would have been our priority. And we had parked up a discreet distance from the church, up on the footpath at the roundabout opposite the church. And the funeral had arrived. And at that stage, we didn't have anything that we were interested in at all at that stage. And we were about to leave when this car pulled into the space behind us. It was a small little car, but it wouldn't have fit in. It was trying to squeeze into a spot between us and the car that was parked behind us. And I turned around to the driver. I said, would you move on a bit since we're going anyway? You move up and let this fella park, because I assumed he was going to the funeral.
Yeah.
And next fella got out of the car and came up and looked in the window of our vehicle and said, oh yeah, there's a fella in there with a camera, all right. No, I wasn't in there. I had a camera in the car, obviously, but I wasn't taking pictures and I wasn't holding the camera at the time. And with that, the other fella got out of the car and I immediately recognized him as Fixer. So of course I grabbed the camera and I said to the driver, I said, "Geez, there's Fixer."
Yeah.
And I turned to take a picture of him, and he opened the back door of the car and leaned in. And next he appeared out and he had a piece of paper in his hand. And I was kind of bemused, I'd say, at this, thinking, is he going to come over and take the number of the car, or what's he at? And with that, he made a lunge at the car with this mad, aggressive head on him.
Yeah.
And he leapt at the car, and all of a sudden we had gone from having no story to having a splash.
And everybody,
or should I say, a splat all over the back window.
And everybody who's seen that story has asked me, did he have prepared in advance for
He must
coming?
have had. I mean, all I can say is he leaned into the back of the car and he appeared out from the back door holding this piece of paper, and he ran up and he splattered it on the window and started smearing it on the window. And the driver said, "What's happening?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I think he's smearing shit all over the window." And he said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "Well, she may as well go. We're going anyway, like, you know." And we were laughing at the good of it, you know. And
Ernie,
I was thinking, like, you know, it's a disgusting thing for somebody to do. And to come prepared, he must have had malice aforethought. I would have thought maybe if he did intend to do that. you know.
Well, he obviously intended to do something. I mean, there's very few people, I imagine,
You have
who
to
drive
assume
around.
that, like, you know.
Now, Sean the
And he-
Fixer Fitzgerald is somebody who has been in and out of all our lives for quite some time. And each incident that we have with him is just ever more bizarre, isn't it? Like, I mean, you take photographs of all sorts of people, many of them from the criminal fraternity. A lot of people don't know you're photographing them. Some do, and they'll turn their heads. They might put a newspaper or a hat down over them. They might try and thwart your photograph in some way. But the Fixer Fitzgerald always gives that little bit more.
Yeah, and like we hadn't photographed him, I'd say, in 10 years. Like, he was well off our radar.
Yeah.
But having said that, because of past experiences, when you see him, you go, hey, up, you know, we grab his picture while he's there, you know?
Yeah.
But I never expected anything like that. And the thing is, when you think about it, the disgusting part of it is, he had no gloves on.
Oh.
He had raw poo in his hand. He splattered it on the window. It splashed everywhere.
All over him as well.
You'd have to assume that he then went over to the church and was offering condolences to the grieving family, which usually involves shaking hands.
Well, maybe a bit.
I was just thinking, thank God that they've done away with the offering each other the sign of peace in the mass now since COVID. Did people actually realise, you know, say, where had he been? What had he been doing before he went over there?
It is.
I don't think anybody would have been that keen to get that close to him.
Is it a photography first for the Sunday World? Like, we've had photographers attacked and, you know, various...
We've had lots of stuff thrown at us over the years. It's the first time I've had stuff thrown at the car and the car door kicked and the car windows marked with stuff. But yeah, I think
it's a shitty.
It was definitely a first, you know, a shitty thing to do, like you say, part of the fun.
So, of course, in true tabloid fashion, the thing to do is turn the story around, which is exactly what happened. And anybody who wants to read about the filthy fixer, they can do so on the SundayWorld.com website the moment the snarling criminal smears window of a Sunday World vehicle with feces. So how do you go about turning this story around? Of course, you, as always, managed to grab your camera while the action was happening and got some pretty extraordinary photographs of the fixer looking just pretty insane and angry, looking in the window with this said item in his hand. So you went a step further, and of course, he drew you to his home later in the week to ask the questions about what was he doing?
Yes, well, it wasn't actually me who went out to the door, but he was doorstepped in true Sunday World fashion and asked for his comments as to what he thought he was trying to achieve. Really, he just gave us a story. In trying to stop us getting a story, he gave us a better one.
Do you think he actually likes being in the media?
I would think he possibly does, because he hasn't been in the news for, as I said, I can remember, for about 10 years since we were on his doorstep when he famously sellotaped his mouth shut.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that was about 10 years ago. And he hasn't been on our radar since. Maybe he's just getting a bit lonesome for the attention.
I'd say that could be it. I mean, at one point he was very much on the radar, and we're going to go through a couple of those incidents that we had with him. In a way, the Sunday World at one point went to war with the fixer because, he was kind of complaining us, and we were paying more heed to him probably because of that reason. He was relevant in the years gone by. He was part of John Gilligan's network. And in recent years, he has just become, I think, a figure of, disgust at this stage. But he's one of those people who, in tabloid terms, in old school, old-fashioned tabloid terms, is the gift that keeps giving.
Yes, I would have to agree with you on that. And you'd have to question if it's intentional on his part to get the attention.
So, Ernie, do you think he woke up the morning of Fran The Lamb Cunningham's funeral and thought, you know what, the Sunday World might be here. I have a kind of an idea what sort of a vehicle they might be in if they cover this funeral. Because, as you say, we have covered funerals in the past, not necessarily to intrude on grief, but because significant characters may show up at them. In particular, John Cunningham would have been somebody we'd be still interested in. But do you think he woke up that morning and instead of flushing, packed up the car?
I can't comment on that.
No.
I do think that he was on the lookout for any suspicious vehicles. Like you say, it's quite common that we would be at these funerals. Now, more so if the death itself involved a crime, such as in a gangland shooting, it's more likely to attract the attention of the media. Outside of that, as you say, if it was like a colourful ex-criminal or current criminal character who might attract other criminals to his funeral, we would go along to see who would be there. But and not necessarily to cover the actual funeral, but just to see who might show up. And I think he kind of thought that we would be there, and he was looking out for us.
I mean,
I think he had a plan. You know, I mean, you don't carry poo in your car unless you intend. Don't put a gun unless you intend to use it.
No,
you don't carry poo unless you intend to smear it. Like,
I keep getting asked as well, was it human or animal poo? And I said, well, like we haven't gone to DNA test.
No,
just yet.
We did take samples for posterity or posteriority.
But I want to ask you, Ernie, before we let you go, because we know we have a long drive back. So I've worked with you for many years, and I know that you're impeccably clean and pristine about the vehicles that you're in, to the extent that, certainly as a passenger at any point, I would have always taken my bottles of water and everything out with me, made sure to keep it as you had presented it. What did you do?
Are you suggesting I should have gathered it and brought it back to him? No, he did. He just drove the car to a car wash and drove through a car wash. I don't know what he expected. Like,
yeah.
It wasn't going to cause us any great concern.
Yeah.
And in fact, then it's one of those times when you're trying to take a picture through the laughing,
Yeah.
And you're shaking with the laughing and still trying to get the picture at the same time. It's happened a few times in the past, as you know, but it's just one of those things. Like, you're sitting there kind of like, oh, what the hell is he doing? Like, where did he get the shit? Like, he's up there at the back of the car, and to see the snarly head of him, like,
the pictures are absolutely. The pictures are fantastic.
What's going on here? Like, you know what I mean? Like, does he realize, like, that we're sitting here waiting for something like this to happen, like, and he's just handing it to him, putting himself on a plate for us, like, I mean, if you ever want to end up on the front page of the Sunday World, that's how you go about it.
I wouldn't.
If you're trying to keep a low profile.
I wouldn't advertise that, Ernie. You never know. You just wouldn't advertise that. But listen, pictures are fantastic. Some of your best work, I have to say. For those with,
I thought it was pretty shitty myself,
for those with a stronger stomach. Anyway, we'll leave you go because you have a long drive home, and thanks for that.
Yes.
Thanks, Ernie.
No bother.
So that was. I'm not going to call Ernie a veteran because I'd die for that. But that was our hardworking photographer, Ernie Leslie, and this story about the filthy fixer. And like, I have to say, I did think it's a classic. Like, it is a classic.
It's kind of it's an old school, isn't it? Sunday World.
It's old school. Everybody here going on, because I mean, as we can see, the fixer must be well in his 70s. Yeah, he's 78.
Yeah.
Now, I've had many's a run in with the fixer, I can tell you, over the years, to the extent that myself and Mick McCaffrey at one point used to call Fridays, Fixer Fridays, because every Friday he used to come into the office with a complaint about one or the other of us about something we were doing, which was nothing to do with him even.
No, and he regularly would visit the Sunday World offices with complaints,
letters of complaint, complaints.
Like he's a guy who was probably in the Sunday World for plenty of times over 4 decades. Would it be even that long?
Easily.
Yeah.
I mean, but to be honest with you, he sort of ended up like, it's almost like a game nearly when he's sort of, he's goading us and we'd be goading him back in a way. It's not real proper journalism when it comes to the Fixer. It's just, but he reminded me in the days that, he was sort of hounding me and I him. He reminded me of a Victor Meldrew style character.
Yeah.
So crotchety. There was absolutely no way that he wasn't going to make a complaint about you no matter what you did. Even if you wrote about somebody else. There was some tale at one point that there was some Gardaí around a property connected to him.
Yeah.
And they found this sort of outdoor shed which had loads of Sunday World pages plastered to the walls with my name and Mick's name on it and big red circles around them and incorrect, wrong, and big X's all over it and everything. So it was a slight little bit of an obsession. Where did it all go wrong?
Well, I mean, look, I don't know. I suppose the Fixer was from the first generation really of celebrity criminals, I suppose. He was an associate of Martin the General Cahill. So that was in the 1980s. And they were the first guys who became known nationwide for criminality. Like those people had existed, of course, in for generations in other countries. You had the Crays in England, or you had, Ned Kelly in Australia or whatever. But Martin Cahill was the first kind of semi-folk hero.
Non-paramilitary,
outlaw that became famous. And Sean the Fixer Fitzgerald was somebody that was in his general circle. He was probably more a close friend of John Traynor, who was known as the coach, maybe so even more than Martin Cahill. And he would have known John Gilligan as well, and the Viper, Martin Foley. So he would have been associating with all of them. He certainly wasn't regarded as, I've never really heard him described as anything in connection with any violence or anything of that sort. But they were kind of, he was maybe involved in the sort of movement of goods and things like that, as opposed to maybe the more high
he
risk.
sort of, I think, liked to see himself as the intellectual and as this sort of advisor.
Yes.
And the Fixer.
The Fixer.
And the Fixer in many ways, he sort of, who gave him that nickname? I don't know.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean,
was it his own or whatever? But he liked that nickname. He likes that nickname, the Fixer. And he would have seen himself as somebody who was just a step above. He was well read. He thought he knows the law. He'd be able to give advice to these criminals that he was sort of associating with.
And he was, I suppose, the guy whose funeral he was attending, Fran The Lamb Cunningham, would have been the same. Like they were, like Fran The Lamb Cunningham, again, even though his brother was a very feared figure, Fran The Lamb Cunningham was more of a fraudster and a fence, and a guy who would move money or move stolen goods or was involved in kind of scams. I mean, Fran Cunningham, actually, when he passed away, you could see it on Facebook. People really liked the guy. You know, I mean, people.
I had a lot of messages from people who knew him. From the criminal fraternity.
Yeah, and nobody
had a fondness for him. He was a bit of a gangster, kind of bit of old school.
An old school, guys that are gone, like that sort of fencing stolen goods. I mean, that just doesn't really happen anymore. Or I think he was involved in, selling off jewellery and other sort of scams involving banks. I mean, Fran The Lamb, was like universally sort of spoken well of. And you see if you look at RIP.ie, sometimes you get a sense of who they are, and it's all his neighbours saying he was a gentleman, a lovely guy, and undoubtedly he was. I think the Fixer would like to see himself in that category, but I think he's probably not in that category, is he?
Just a bit odder than the rest of them. Of course, Fran The Lamb Cunningham was, we meant to do a podcast on
We
him,
did.
and we haven't
We
got
did.
around to it, but just to place him, his brothers Michael Cunningham and John Cunningham were responsible for the Jennifer Guinness kidnap. Michael Cunningham was very much a family man, and I think John Cunningham is also.
Yeah.
They were jailed for that kidnapping after 7 days. I think Jennifer Guinness was,
Yeah, I mean, it was
held.
Yeah.
And there was a shootout on the Waterloo Road, and they were, they were caught and they were jailed for up to 2 decades each. When they were put away, they relied on the likes of John Gilligan to try and look after their wives and families. I don't think that totally worked out very well. But they were seen at the time that they arranged that. They were kind of coming in on the coattails of the IRA, and those kidnaps were, during the 80s, were fairly high profile.
They really were.
They're seen as so high risk now that people just don't really kidnap anymore. But it was sort of said they did, I'm sure Jennifer Guinness was terrified.
Yeah.
Absolutely terrified, but that they treated her okay, and they were the kind of guys that this was going to be the big one.
Yeah.
I mean, take yourself back. They wanted to make $1 million.
Yeah.
That was their ambition in life, was to make $1 million.
Yeah.
Michael Cunningham went to jail, missed his wife an awful lot, came out and got involved in little bits and bobs, never really made a huge name for himself again. John Cunningham left Shelton Abbey in the late 90s.
Yeah, I mean, towards the absolute
Very
end
end
of
of
the
the
sentence, really
sentence,
bizarre one, because he was put in an open prison. He was a number of months left to go of a really lengthy sentence, and he absconded. And of course, during his time in prison, John Cunningham struck up a really close friendship with Christy Cunningham Senior.
Yeah.
I mean, that is the core of it. And
Cunningham left Shelton Abbey and headed straight for Amsterdam, where Kinahan had established their beginnings of the Kinahan cartel, the drug business. But I think Kinahan had returned for his father's funeral. There was a warrant and a kind of a jail term awaiting him, and he was put in. So Cunningham took over and was later targeted by the police in the Netherlands, caught red-handed with drugs, jailed. As Kinahan gets out, they were like Lanigan's Ball, the two of them, for a little while. There was always one in, one out. I think he was returned to finish that Shelton Abbey sentence. And eventually the two of them wash up on the Costa del Sol, where, the roots of the Kinahan cartel take shape. By 2010, John Cunningham is arrested and described as the number 2 in the Kinahan organisation.
yeah, and pictured and looking very healthy and well at the time, and then kind of falls off the
Goes to
radar
ground,
again.
Yeah.
So,
And I mean, there's very little information about him. He obviously didn't return for his brother Fran's funeral. But anyway, that's who Fran The Lamb Cunningham is, where he came out of. So back to the Fixer.
Yeah.
The Fixer, I think around the time Veronica Guerin is killed, all of a sudden that Gilligan gang take on a new sense of...
I think the Fixer would have been on the outskirts of the Gilligan gang, in fairness. I don't think he would have been in any way on an inner circle.
Nor was he, I don't think, privy to Veronica Guerin's murder.
No, absolutely not. I mean, he would have known John Gilligan from his kind of pre-drug days, I would have said. John Gilligan, of course, was a robber really for most of his criminal career, and would have come from Ballyfermot and specialised in robbing factories, earning him the nickname Factory John. So John Gilligan for a large part of his career would have been involved in, I think even in the most recent documentary, describes robbing TVs and having to then sell them off. These things don't really exist in gangland terms, really, and to the extent that they did. But that was big money at the time and a big business. And the Fixer would have been associating with them. As Gilligan moved into drugs, I don't think he would have had much to do with him, but would have retained, would have known him from all those years. The Fixer himself, I don't think, has amassed much of a criminal history, but he did. In 2003, he was jailed himself for 5 years for handling a stolen sports car and setting parts of it on fire. While he went on trial, there was this big investigation into an alleged attempt to nobble a jury. But ultimately, the Fixer was sentenced to 4 years for handling the stolen car, to run concurrently with a 5-year sentence for setting fire to it. And that was probably his major criminal past. So he would have got a 5-year sentence. He would have come out then, you're talking something like 20 years ago at this stage. He would have been in his late 50s. Gangland, as it exists, would have been absolutely different than what he would have grown up with, what he would have come of age with. The world had changed dramatically. So
But those links to the Gilligan gang remained, and I think what incensed him a lot of the time, and which was, formed a lot of complaints that he had sent in over the years, was the allegation that he would have been somebody who possibly helped John Traynor go on the, would you say, on the run, certainly leave the country in the aftermath of the Gilligan murder.
Yeah.
That he would have been in contact with Traynor and maybe gave him some help along the way. And that incensed him. He would have always said he had nothing to do with it, that was lies. But his links to the Gilligan gang, as they turn toxic, as they turn from this crew that are stealing TVs and selling them on, to a gang that have murdered and taken on the state, he doesn't like his links to them anymore, and he's very much trying to distance himself. And I think that's really where he came to verbal blows, maybe with ourselves in the Sunday World and with other media.
Yeah, and I think, look, he probably had a fair point. I mean, he wasn't a member of the Gilligan gang as they moved into drugs. Like, he just wasn't. But people know people growing up, and that's just the way it is. And, so he did obviously find that to be something that he didn't want to be associated with.
Well, he certainly tried to remove himself from them completely.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately for the Fixer, when Gilligan was released from jail in 2013...
See, the Fixer could have become a footnote in history, really.
Totally.
And he would have become a footnote in history. Nobody would have displayed any particular interest in him. But what happened when John Gilligan got out was John Gilligan had gone to prison as the number one gangster in the country. And by the time he got out, he was simply not there, was he? Now, what always happens with these guys is that, in all of the drugs trade and the underworld trade, like we've spoken about it before, there's a huge amount of debts and things on credit and people gonna owe this for that. And John Gilligan felt he was owed money. He felt he was owed money that hadn't been paid when he was in prison. And when he got out, he felt he was entitled to collect some of that money off some of the people. And you wrote about the fallout from that, I suppose.
Well, I think, as he was to be released, in and around that time, Mick McCaffrey was working with us, and he went and tracked down John Traynor.
Yeah. And
I visited a well-known criminal called Noel King-Size Duggan, the late Noel King-Size Duggan, who was murdered as part of the Kinahan-Hutch feud. But we were making inquiries about this because we had heard that Gilligan had the begging bowl out. Yes, he was owed debts, he believed. But he also believed that there was a criminal fraternity there, that when somebody came out, they should all donate to kind of get you back up on your feet.
Yeah.
So I had been told that one of the people who was putting the begging bowl out from was the Fixer Fitzgerald.
Yeah.
So on the off chance, I called up to Noel Duggan's home. I knocked on the door expecting a tirade of abuse, and instead got brought inside for a chat.
Yeah.
And Duggan was quite happy to see me.
Yeah.
Because he had a story to tell me, and that story was that indeed he had been visited by, he claimed, by the Fixer Fitzgerald, who asked him for money for John Gilligan's fund, as such. And the late Noel Duggan told me that he had run the Fixer out of town and told him never to come back. He put in a stream of expletives about Gilligan and said that he was never going to give him a penny. Nobody puts the squeeze on him for money, he said. And all of a sudden, Fixer is right back at the heart of the Gilligan story.
Did the Fixer subsequently deny all of that?
The Fixer denies everything.
Yeah, he denied that.
He denied that. Now, Traynor, Mick had tracked down Traynor to the UK.
Yeah.
And I just can't recall exactly what Traynor said, but I think he was kind of giving the nod to the same story that, the Fixer was heavily involved in trying to to collect money for Gilligan. So that incensed the fixer that he was back,
Put in that mix.
put in that mix again.
Yeah.
And there started
Yeah.
a mini feud
Yeah.
between
Because
Sunday World journalists and the Fixer
yeah.
Fitzgerald.
And because also remember, there was bad blood from Mick Cunningham, wasn't there, towards John Gilligan as well.
There was.
That was also another feature. John Gilligan obviously subsequently, after getting out of jail, narrowly escaped with his life twice as a result of the hitmen. One of which is believed to have been Trevor Byrne, though he was never prosecuted for it. But what seems to have happened is that Gilligan, and we're not throwing the fixer into this mix, but had Gilligan, through some intermediary, had approached Mick Cunningham's wife, was it, at some point looking for money, as far as I remember.
Well, the story I was told was that Gilligan was asked to provide the Cunningham families,
Yes.
when they were in jail for the Jennifer Guinness kidnap,
Yeah.
with stock that they could sell for Christmas.
Yeah.
They possibly were people working the markets, or
Yeah.
and they were basically not asked exactly for a favour, but just to provide them with enough that they might be able to buy
Yeah.
the kids presents and all the rest of it. The men are in jail, they had trusted Gilligan,
Yeah.
but Gilligan didn't do that. And I was subsequently told that Gilligan had sent heavies in to Mick Cunningham's home and had broken, smashed up furniture because he said that the families actually owed him money.
Yeah.
And that left very, very bad blood
Yes.
between the Cunninghams and Gilligan. And of course, John Cunningham was, rose up the ranks in the Kinahan cartel, while John Gilligan was
Sunk
behind
down the
bars and
ranks.
sunk down the ranks. So, sins of your past and all that, Gilligan came out. And as
So-
you say, it was suspected that it was a Kinahan hitman who had
Yes.
attempted the assassination of John Gilligan.
So somebody being linked with Gilligan at that time was not a good look.
Not safe.
Not a good
No.
look at all, because John Gilligan wasn't safe. I mean, simply wasn't. And, whether the Kinahan cartel, were ordering things or whatever, they certainly found it okay that John Gilligan was a target. I mean, it's simple as that.
And you have to remember that a story long forgotten, but that Dougie Moran, who was
Yeah.
a member of the dissidents,
Yeah.
a Limerick criminal who was linked to the McCarthy Dundons,
Yeah.
he had worked as John Gilligan's bodyguard.
Yeah.
And he was shot dead just weeks before the assassination attempt on Gilligan. As Gilligan sort of tried to muscle his way back in after being released from prison, he became more and more of a target.
Yeah, because Dougie Moran was linked with the Continuity IRA amongst other things. He had a connection with the Dundon McCarthys, particularly some of the people living in Birmingham that were involved in that gang. Dougie Moran, John Gilligan hired him to make him safe, basically, that nobody would take on Dougie Moran because of his dissident links. And as a result, I mean, that case has never been solved and nobody's ever been charged with that murder. But there was always a belief that, the Kinahan cartel made a point of taking out Dougie Moran to say, like, that doesn't work anymore. Hiring some guy with links to the dissident isn't going to keep you safe. And Dougie Moran was shot dead. It was again another. It is kind of a forgotten murder, probably because nobody was ever prosecuted.
So in the aftermath of that, a couple of stories. We've printed out a couple of stories, of course, that we did on the Fixer, as he sort of, I suppose, pushed in here with letters of complaints every Friday and all the rest of it. I suppose the focus went on the Fixer because of his own activities, because of his links to Gilligan, but he did actually get a Garda information message at one point to say that his life was under threat, and he dismissed that. Actually, when we asked him about it, he totally dismissed that. But he was at the time in a relationship with a woman who he bizarrely again sent in around myself and Mick McCaffrey's company in a pub one night, and she tried to put herself into our company. And we knew that she was sending back messages to the Fixer. It was really quite weird.
Yeah.
A little bit like Ernie's experience of it. It's like, what the hell are you doing?
Yeah.
Along with, this is sinister and weird and all the rest of it. But it was not the thought process of your regular
No.
criminal. She tried to join our company and all the rest. But then it turned out that in doing so, she identified herself who she was. And I think Sunday World photographers found the two of them out enjoying a drink and later uncovered her occupation, which was at the time as a stripper.
Yeah.
There's no point in me reading out the headlines on this.
No,
It's old school stuff.
Yeah.
But this went on and on and on. And indeed, the Fixer did at one point put sellotape over his mouth when we went to talk to him about something. I recall he was in the company of a fraudster who had just been released from jail, another kind of jailhouse lawyer, because that's what the Fixer liked to be, an advisor to those on how to get around and get out of the law. And I recall I was in some part of Terranure and I approached the two of them. They had met. This guy just got out of jail for fraud. They'd met. They were kind of swapping papers. They were obviously doing a bit of business. And the Fixer said to me, have you changed your car?
Yeah.
And he reeled off something about a car I had been driving.
Yeah.
In that kind of way, you know, this underhand and really quite cowardly way of threat, as if I was to believe that the Fixer was following me around and knew my vehicles and all this sort of stuff. That's the kind of way he always was.
Yeah.
Always a little bit snide, always a little bit strange. He was constantly down in the courts.
Yeah.
Dipping in and out of court cases. And if you were covering something in the courts and the Fixer was about, you could be assured he'd land into the courtroom to have a good look at you, you know?
Yeah.
Just a kind of a creepy character more than anything, I think.
Like, what were the core of his complaints, do you know?
They were bizarre. Like, his complaints could have been anything. I mean, there were so many of them. Can I even remember them? Because they used to be sort of just almost part of Friday's amusements, that, you know, the security would ring up, the Fixer's here with another letter, and it would either be a complaint about me or make it could be about another story we'd written completely, that he'd found some error in it that might have been absolutely innocuous or, you know, wasn't an error at all. And it could be a 10-page letter about this and about sort of the ethics of journalism. And I think he used to go to the Press Council regularly and the Ombudsman and try and make complaints through them. And then there was be these kind of little strange things would be sent into the office, which we would have suspected were coming from him. I used to get bunches of flowers and all this sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was an odd time. Yeah. We got into much more serious journalism after that.
Well, look, I mean, he obviously felt hard done by, and look, you know, it's a. I think sometimes people, certainly that link with John Gilligan, he obviously felt was particularly toxic. But yeah, like, I hope we don't.
Well, let's remember
it all up again.
Let's remember what he smeared on the window of Ernie.
I know, but it's a funny thing, like for
dirty protest from.
Well, you know, actually, I was actually just thinking that when we were talking. It's a funny Irish tradition.
What is
a dirty protest?
Oh, right. Okay.
Because I was just thinking of that, because obviously the IRA did it in the H blocks, but there was also a few occasions. I mean, Mark. The guinea pig Desmond did it, smeared shit in his face.
Huey Irwin in
Sligo
did it.
Yeah.
And I think, am I right saying Brian Meehan did that, or did he do something slightly?
Something along those lines. So, I mean, it must be a point of rage at which people...
It's rage, and to show your disgust at other people or something.
Yeah. I mean, I always found the one where they smeared themselves with shit their face while being interviewed by guards is a really unusual one.
Disgusting, but it's to make you sick. Like, I mean, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look, whatever it was about, the Fixer has finally got himself a podcast.
Yeah, and a front page,
And a front page.
Yeah.
So he's back in the game at 78. And, you know, if anything... or if nothing else, he's a colourful character.
He is a colourful character, yeah.
Thanks, Niall. I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.